Majority Report with Sam Cedar. It's time to look in the mirror, America. Do you like what you see?
I keep referring to Obama as the magic Negro.
Do you like what you see now?
Well, suck on this.
It's just a mirror, America.
Shared sacrifice by everybody.
What could it do to you except reflect your image?
I did nothing wrong at the Minneapolis airport.
The Majority Report.
Far more credible to me than PBS and Frontline.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Thursday, February 23rd. Actually, it's a week away because we're live to tape. My name is Michael Brooks on a Michael Thursday, and this is the 4-time award-winning Majority Report, recording live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, it's an episode of Two Dope Boys and a Podcast. It's that growing show that I co-host with my comrade, Phil McKenzie. It comes out twice a week. It's a show that deals with business, deals with the future of the economy, race, class, trends, brands, and somehow still manages to give me a lot of opportunities to impersonate Barack Obama as a Nation of Islam minister. Why? Well, because I just do the impression regardless of the context. I just bulldoze that in there, man. I don't care where I am or who I'm speaking to. We could be having Nobel laureates on. I'll do that impression. On today's program, though, this is from our On Point segment. We have 2 shows that come out a week. One on Tuesday, we do 4 different segments. We do the brand F-up of the week, where we make fun of a brand, whether it is a clothing company, a police department, or the United Nations that has effed up. We explain why, we make fun of them, and we draw bigger lessons from it. Then we give you a What's Up segment. That's something that's happening now that we can draw lessons from about how we're organizing our economy and our lives. These are things like Finland introducing a living wage. Then we have What's Next. That's something like Cambridge Analytics. And was this the secret evil Svengali strategy behind Trump and the rise of the far right? Analytics and the alt-right. Then we give you a Crates pick. And then on Thursday, we do On Point, which is our in-depth interview segment. And we interview lots of different types of people. And on today's show, you'll be hearing an interview which Phil will explain to you for just a moment with Phil.
Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the author of Stamped from the Beginning. It is a National Book Award winner, and it covers your definitive history of all things race.
All things race and all things racist. And what was really interesting about this interview is he tracks the full history of both racist and anti-racist ideas in America, and kind of similar to Nicholas Giat, who wrote, I believe it was, I actually forget the name of that, Matt. I wish I had it in front of me. Let me just look this up here for one moment. Nicholas Giat's book was Bind Us Apart, How Enlightened Americans Invented Racial Segregation. He was on the show a couple of months ago, and you could think of this book, they come together, this book, Stamped from the Beginning, and a big part of it is demonstrating the history of racism in quote-unquote anti-racist or non-racist ideas. So we get to a lot here. You get a flavor of what we do on the show. There's a link on the blog post to subscribe to Two Dope Boys in a Podcast. Many of you have already, and same values, same vibe, but different content and different focus. So I hope you'll enjoy this interview and join us over at Two Dope Boys and a Podcast. Enjoy, everybody.
Welcome to Two Dope Boys and a Podcast. I'm Phil McKenzie.
I'm Michael Brooks.
On Point is where we highlight someone getting it right, and we're really excited to be joined on the show by Professor Ibram X. Kendi, who's the author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. It is a National Book Award winner. I've been fortunate enough to go through the book as well as some of his other work, and found it to be illuminating, to put it lightly. So, Dr. Kendi, I mean, Professor Kendi, why don't we start off by you just kind of giving us a sense of what was your idea and what were some of the goals you had behind writing this book, Stamped from the Beginning?
Well, I guess initially the goal was just to present really the first sort of comprehensive history of racist ideas from their origins to the present. So, I really wanted people in our time who recognize the existence of racist ideas to realize the roots, the historical roots of those ideas, sort of where they came from, when they were developed, why they were developed, who developed them, and what type of impact they had on American society.
Now, in the book, you kind of used like 5 primary figures, one of whom I was not familiar with at all, which starts off the book, Cotton Mather, Thomas Jefferson, William Lloyd Garrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Angela Davis. Can you kind of walk us through like what prompted you to use those 5 figures in particular? Obviously, you could have picked many others, but what was your thought process behind those 5 as framing these ideas?
Well, first and foremost, I wanted the book to be as accessible as possible, to read in a way like a story, and therefore I think it would be easier for people to read. And so, in thinking from that standpoint, we decided to really sort of use 5 major characters to sort of flow the narrative through their lives and through their ideas. And each of these characters were typically people who were at the forefront of the debates between racist and anti-racist ideas, and their sort of their lives sort of bracketed important periods in American history. And then they were also quite influential themselves in terms of pioneering or even challenging racist or anti-racist ideas. And, I think each of these characters, their lives were quite interesting. And so I think it's interesting for the reader to sort of learn this larger history through these 5 people.
Use those because I think there's what's among many things that are really important and impressive about this book is I think that this history where you're shedding light on not only the things that are kind of like commonly and sort of comfortably accepted in quote unquote liberal circles as we can all agree that that's racist and bad, like the really obvious overt and obscene manifestations of racism, but you also are tracking a history of racist ideology that actually kind of emerges through progressive and liberal and I guess keyword assimilationist traditions in America. Could you kind of set the table on that, and if possible, maybe loop that to some of the examples from those 5 that you used to kind of set out the different options, sort of origin stories of racism and race that we're still living out in American society today?
Sure. So when we, I think, have a very narrow definition of a racist idea, a narrow definition, and even to a certain extent misguided definition that only really points to, let's say, segregationists and slaveholders as the only people who were truly racist. Well, I also recognize that if you ask most people today, they'll say that they're not racist. And then you ask them, well, what is a racist idea? They really won't be able to sort of tell you. And so, one of the things that I set out to do was to truly define it in a very clear-cut way, and then sort of go into history to sort of locate those types of ideas. So I defined a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And my book was stamped from the beginning was about anti-black racist ideas that suggested that there was something wrong or inferior about a black group or about black people. And so we traditionally have recognized the ways in which certain people have asserted that black people are genetically or even permanently inferior, which in the book I identify as a segregationist idea. But we haven't been willing to acknowledge as racist ideas those who state that black people are in some ways culturally inferior or black people are in some ways behaviorally inferior.
So just to be clear, sorry, would that, like, an example of that would be like the Moynihan Report or something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who did not express anything about black people being genetically inferior, but he did state black people were culturally or even behaviorally inferior. But when it comes to progressive thought, progressives typically state, yes, black people are inferior, but they're inferior because of their history of oppression. And so you can't, it's because slavery has literally made black people inferior. Segregation, poverty, discrimination has literally made black people inferior. It's sort of debased their morals, their mentalities, their behaviors, and that's why they're not as smart as white people. That's why they're not as moral. And in the book, I show that even those ideas have never been proven, and most of them have actually been disproven.
Right.
These progressive ideas that suggest that somehow discrimination was not only dehumanizing, but it actually did dehumanize black people.
Could you give some specific examples of some of those myths that have been debunked?
So to give an example, I think one of the more prominent ones, you just mentioned the Moynihan report. Moynihan, who leaned on E. Franklin Frazier, another pioneering black sociologist, looked at the larger and the growing percentage of black children that were being born in single-parent households, and assessed from that basically black families were pathological. Black families, these single-parent households, were pathological, and this growing percentage of children born in black households stated that there must be something wrong with with black relationships. There must be something wrong with black fathers. There must be something wrong with black mothers. And, research has shown that this increase especially over the last 50 years of the 20th century in the percentage of black children born to single-parent households is not because single black people are having more children, as is commonly thought. It's actually because married black people are having less children, which then has led to an overall increase in the percentage of black children being born to single parent. Because it's either or. Either you have that growing percentage, either because single people are having more children or married people are having less. And it's actually the latter.
Right. So just to kind of put a sort of pin on it, because I think this is important, and obviously we'll get right back to Phil, but that this is the tradition in this book that you identify, and I just would put it in like modern vernacular as like, I mean, of course that like, it's really bad in, fill in the blank neighborhood or whatever, because I mean, those people have been treated so badly. And there's this notion that you're actually expressing like an enlightened sentiment, but you're actually carrying the tradition of racism that the only distinguishing marker, which I mean is a worthwhile thing to note, and obviously you do note it, is that this isn't some like innate, biological condition that's inescapable. It's just this social thing, and we can actually in some ways very kind of condescendingly and paternalistically respond to it. I just wanted to sort of underline that, but yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that really jumped out to me, and you did a great job, is in very early on in the book, you mentioned that, racist ideas as a concept, as a philosophy can be held by anyone, even those who are the aggrieved, those who are victims of those racist ideas. And you alluded to, as you wrote the book, having to go through your own personal process of debunking racist ideas that you held. Could you walk us through some of that?
Sure. And so, I think in other areas, feminist scholars have been able to recognize the existence of patriarchal women. Scholars of the LGBT community have been able to recognize the existence of homophobic gays and lesbians. But, I wanted to sort of continue to introduce this idea of anti-Black or racist Black people, and Black people who think that there's something wrong or inferior about Black people. And I just show that these ideas about something being wrong with Black people are being consumed and sometimes reproduced by everyone, including Black people. And so I had to sort of come to grips with the racist ideas that I had consumed. So, I actually did think that there was a problem with the Black family, as many Black people think, until I was slapped in the face with the evidence. I also thought, for instance, that Black neighborhoods were more dangerous than white neighborhoods, until I was slapped in the face of evidence that shows that most of those perceptions are based on notions that arrest and incarceration rates are reflective of actual crime rates, and that people commit crimes all the time and don't get arrested. And I also realized that there's a direct correlation across racial groups, studies show, between unemployment rates and violent crime, and which means that instead of classifying a such thing as a dangerous Black neighborhood, it's actually more statistically appropriate to talk about dangerous unemployed neighborhoods.
And I want to take that a little further to talk about this idea of assimilationism, which is, again, one of those racist ideas, meaning Blacks can be, you talk about this a lot, particularly in the early portions of the book, the Cotton Mather portions, the Thomas Jefferson portions, as they were sort of early abolitionist movements, Quaker movements, that this concept that Blacks can be basically inferior, but they can be assimilated as they get closer to being white. And I highlighted a lot that section that had to do with what's called uplift-suasion. And it made me parallel to what people would call respectability politics. Like, kind of tell us more and parallel those two things, because instantly as I was reading those sections of the book, I thought about this argument that exists within the Black community around respectability politics.
Yeah, so I think I sort of found that in the 1790s, white abolitionists, recognizing there were a growing number of free Blacks, basically started going into these Black communities and telling these people that their behavior is going to basically dictate the future course of slavery. In other words, they would say things like, white people think that Black people are inferior, but you can change that by your own uplift, by demonstrating, uplifting yourselves and thereby defying stereotypes. So when you do that, you'll defy stereotypes which underlie slavery. But then when you act in a negative way, you'll reinforce stereotypes which will then harden slavery. And Black elites in particular sort of became, in a way, the sort of really adopted this theory of what I called uplift-suasion, Blacks uplifting themselves and thereby persuading away the racist ideas of whites. But what's inherent in this theory is that Black people are actually down in a behavioral or cultural way, which and typically the people who stated that standardized the ways and behaviors of white people and stated that black people have the capacity to reach those standards one day. And that's what we should do to sort of uplift ourselves to those superior white standards and thereby persuade away the racist ideas of whites, which people call the politics, of course, of respectability. But I really wanted to sort of show the importance of persuasion, which is why I called it sort of uplift-suasion.
Do you think, and then that raises another sort of interesting thing that this book alludes to, and it actually reminded me. This is a little far afield, but back when I wrote my undergraduate thesis, and then I stopped because I'm not like you, Professor. I did not have the discipline to keep going, but I did mine on comparative human rights, and there was this debate that was very interesting. It was called the Asian values debate. And it was actually spearheaded by leaders of like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and Mahathir in Malaysia. And they basically would say, you can't hold us to human rights standards, global human rights standards, because we have a different sort of cultural basis for how we do politics. And then the response was problematic in different ways because, one response is, well, who cares about your culture? We know how to do human rights. You just got to catch up. Or there would be a cynical agreement with this cynical use of cultural politics because, of course, these are political leaders who, and they're using smart and expedient tools of saying, like, that's true. Asians don't have a concept of human rights. And then Amartya Sen, who I built my thesis around, and this will get to the question, he came along and he said, everybody's wrong here. The point is actually that human rights are universal, and you can find foundations of getting to any of these places from any tradition you can imagine. There's an Indian tradition, there's an African tradition, there's an Islamic tradition that values, human rights, equality, open exchange, and you just have to look for the roots. So the problem is when certain categories get classified as Western or white. So I guess as a kind of pivot out of that, is that like the other part of this conversation too, is realizing that like ways of establishing how to do culture, how to create human situations and institutions that work, there's obviously no monopoly on that. And there's different ways of going about things and different ways that we can improve things, more broadly and from many different sources. So is that also kind of part of the lesson of what we have to deal with, is like stopping, sort of situating these things in one white or Western standard?
Yes, and so I think that's what some scholars have called cultural relativity, which is this recognition of the differences between different cultures, and then simultaneously leveling those differences. And so not any single culture sort of standardizing sort of their way and then sort of measuring and judging every other culture from their way. Because literally you take any culture in the world, if it standardizes its culture and then measures every other culture from it, every other culture is going to seem inferior.
Right, of course. Right.
And so that's precisely what many of these cultural racists in the text did, who would also be called assimilationists. So they standardized sort of their way. I mean, even something as simple as literacy. Like if you standardize what is literate, and your sense of literacy is based on, let's say, your language, then anybody who, of course, does not read and write your language is going to seem inferior. And so there are so many different ways in which assimilationists have sort of standardized their culture in America or even in the Western world, and then judged African people as inferior.
And then make a category mistake, right? Because you're confusing the specific skill. And obviously in today's world, some of these things are just like technical necessities for life in certain environments. But you're confusing a skill set with intelligence, which are two different propositions. So those things got slid all the time, and that's how this kind of plays out.
But we've, eugenicists in particular, a century ago, conceived of something that we now call standardized tests, that you
Right.
can actually standardize
Right.
intelligence. And of course, these standardized tests have proliferated and more or less serves as doors of opportunity in the United States. And so people still believe that you can standardize something as subjective as intelligence. I mean, intelligence is as subjective as beauty.
Mm-hmm. And it's been and it still has the same that's the level playing field. If you come from any environment and you know how to test well, then we know that you're meant. I mean, and of course, in our world, it's not even, forget even just massive success, basic survival, because we don't want to like provide basic survival more broadly. But yeah, anyway.
No, I think this allows to kind of fast forward a little bit. It's away from the book, but I think it's connected in that the themes are there. You wrote a piece in the New York Times for their Sunday Review opinion. It's about a month ago, a little less than a month ago, actually, dated January 21st, talking about this idea of racial progress. And the full title of the article is Racial Progress is Real, but so is Racist Progress. And when I read it, I was in the middle of reading the book and finishing the book. And the story that you tell as characterized through these five historical figures and the narrative that you shared in this New York Times piece, I thought were very much kind of dancing with one another. You know, we have this sort of linear idea of history, I guess is the popular way in which it's usually taught, dates, this happened and this happened and this happened. And you make an argument when it comes to race, or you offer a thesis that it's not really that linear. Like we're kind of having this push-pull behind the racial progress and then the racist progress as well.
Yeah, and if we want to think about it as linear, then we would have to think about it as having two forces, two linear forces, as opposed to just one singular linear force. And so I just wanted to sort of show in that New York Times piece, as well as to a large extent in Stamped from the Beginning, that, we've had these two historical forces that, and people have been able to recognize, especially as it relates to Black life, the ways in which Black people have progressed over the course of American history. But people have not been, I think, as able to recognize the ways in which discriminators have made progress over the course of American history. The way and how both can happen sort of simultaneously. And I think the reason why people have not been able to realize racist progress is because of racist ideas. What racist ideas have done is it causes us to not recognize the existence of racial discrimination. Like every racist idea has been like a post-racial idea. It has caused us to blame Black people, something being wrong or inferior about Black people, and therefore not be able to see the actual racial discrimination, the actual policy that's causing that inequity, that is then causing us to say that there's something wrong with Black people. To say it more simply, every racial inequality or racial disparity has either two causes. Either Black inferiority is causing that inequality, or racist policy. Either the Black unemployment rate over the last 50 years is twice as high as the white unemployment rate because there's something wrong with Black workers. White workers are better, which is why they're more likely to be more employed, or it's job discrimination. And so racist ideas cause us to say, oh, it's something wrong with Black workers. They're lazy, they want to be on welfare, they're not qualified, and therefore it doesn't cause us to see the job discrimination. And therefore the policies that are constantly becoming more sophisticated that prevent Black people from basically gaining employment.
And this goes into your idea that these ideas are perpetrated and spread by those who are powerful. I think there's also this narrative that racism and being racist is the purview of the ignorant. And it sounds like you would argue that that's actually not the case, that it's those who are in positions of power to benefit from these ideas that support, that then will lead to policy. Is that going in the right direction?
Yes. And so we've, of course, been taught this narrative that ignorance is actually what is behind racist ideas.
Right.
And racist ideas have then led to racist policies. Well, I actually find that that's ahistorical, and it's actually quite the opposite. That very powerful people have instituted racist policies out of economic, political, and even cultural self-interest. And then they have, or their sort of defenders, have produced racist ideas to normalize the effects of those policies, which are racial inequality, to justify those racist policies. And then the circulation of those racist ideas is actually what has caused us to become ignorant and hateful. And we see this, with voter suppression laws over the last 8 years. These policies were created for a particular party to gain or maintain power. It's a very clear political self-interest. And then they created justifications to substantiate those policies, which is that there's a massive amount of voter fraud, which sort of hangs on this very old racist idea about the corrupt black voter. And then people consume this idea, and then that makes them hateful. They go up to polls with their guns, or it makes them ignorant about the voting process, because they're, of course, voter fraud is not an issue. But you have a lot of people thinking ignorantly that it is.
Do you think then that this is, because it actually kind of reminds me of something you said at the beginning, which I have a potential answer for. You said, when you ask most people what racism actually is, or what would constitute being a racist, and they can't really answer it. And I think that's true, but my sense is, at least, conversations I've had, is that it always is, to the extent any answer is given, it's always a question of personal moral judgment. So, I'm not, because I, don't use certain words, or I don't hate people, or whatever. And then when that happens, it's taken out of the material conversations you're talking about. I think voter suppression is such a great example, because there's plenty of people who engage in voter suppression today. Just, they could not have any what we would classically categorize as racist beliefs in their body at all, and they could just exercise the pure political self-interest that they're going to win if certain people don't get the vote. So therefore, they're going to exercise and create a structure of white supremacy. Has nothing to do with their sort of, intelligence, or even kind of personal morals in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think part of the confusion has been that abolitionists and even civil rights activists have made the issue of race, or the problem of race, into what's a moral problem.
Right.
And so, so I think that's created a lot of confusion, because the people who have tried to eliminate racism have misread, its sort of fundamental basis. And so it's not a moral problem. It's fundamentally a power problem. Mm-hmm. And the people who have instituted racist policies and produced racist ideas have done so for clear sort of political and economic and cultural gain. And some of these people were like, for them, it had nothing to do with morals. It had to do with, I want to continue to make money enslaving people. I want to continue to make money off of cheap black sharecroppers. I want to continue to make money off of private prison labor. And so, they're going to then champion those ideas that keep black people enslaved, segregated, or incarcerated.
I'm going to ask a question in the frame of another book that I read for the first time middle of last year, that has kind of blown up my mind a little bit as it pertains to race and race conversations. Are you familiar with Racecraft by Barbara Fields and Karen Fields?
I've heard about the book, and I've read parts of it.
Okay. Then it might not be a fair question, but it basically challenges these ideas of race as a reality, as a real thing, and uses racecraft to frame, taking it from witchcraft, meaning that race is almost like a an idea and a concept, a superstition that we've been conditioned to believe over X number of millennia. And I'm curious if, given what you do know of the concept and their work, if this idea of racist ideas being spread, can it be also extended to this idea of race as a whole, or do you see a disconnect or a line in the sand between those two ideas and concepts?
No, I would say that they're intertwined, and so as I show in Stand from the Beginning, the origins of race as a construct, like race was constructed in order to relegate people of color, or in particular black people, in order for slave traders to basically conceive of all of these different ethnic groups that they're enslaving as one people, and then turn around and say that that's one inferior people. They had to create the notion of that, all of those different groups as a single race, which was, of course, inferior and worthy of enslavement. And so I think from the beginning, the construct of race was sort of intertwined with the construct of the black race as being inferior. And so I would agree with that sort of analysis, but I would sort of caution, because I think some people have taken it too far and stated that, okay, the way that we eliminate sort of racism is by no longer talking about race. And because we know that race does not exist, as a scientific construct, we know that even as a genetic construct, race does not exist. So let's just stop talking about race. Let's stop even identifying people by race, and that will then lead to some sort of progress. I would caution against that, because if we do not identify people by race, then we won't be able to identify racial inequality.
Got it. And we're gonna go out on one last question. We're in a national state and maybe even a global state if you look at the rise of sort of nationalist policies around the world in various countries. And your book brings to the forefront so many critical ideas and dives into a history that many people are either unwilling or uncomfortable to deal with. Like, what are maybe one or two ideas that you want to leave our listeners with as they kind of navigate a more heightened racial experience, whether here in the United States or abroad? Obviously, they should all get the book, Stand from the Beginning, but what are some takeaways that maybe they could arm themselves with as we move forward?
Well, I think first and foremost that instead of us trying to, quote, not be racist, I think Stand from the Beginning provides, sort of scratches the surface as to what it means to be an anti-racist. And so I chronicle not just this history of racist ideas that suggest that there's something wrong or inferior about black people, but I also chronicle the history of anti-racist ideas. And so I think, I would hope that people would begin to think about, okay, what does it mean to truly be an anti-racist? What does it mean to truly believe that the racial groups are equal? Well, it means that if the racial groups are equal, then that means that if there are disparities in our society, it must be the result of discrimination. And then my job then as an anti-racist is to figure out where that discrimination is coming from, who is doing it, and to eliminate it. And that, I don't need to spend any time trying to develop or civilize black people as a group, because they're already civilized and developed. I already view them as that there's nothing wrong with them. And so I would sort of encourage people to really begin to think deeply about what it means to be an anti-racist. And then I would also cause people to really reflect on their own ideas that suggest that there's something wrong with black people. And that if, and that's one of the things that I, for instance, had to do, through, writing Stamped from the beginning. Like, I had to challenge my own ideas. And I was open-minded, and I recognized that that's how powerful these ideas are. One of the things you said earlier is how sort of everyone personalizes their sort of definition of racist ideas to sort of exclude themselves. That's actually true. I've yet to come across a group of racists who were willing, or even an individual who was willing to say, yep, my idea is racist. What people do is they create a definition that excludes them. So slave traders, enslavers, mass incarcerators, segregators, the alt-right, all these different groups define racism in a way that excludes them. And I think, we need to be courageous, as human beings and set, a definition of a racist idea, and for it to not be based on what we think about black people. For us to set the definition first and then interrogate ourselves. And, I was willing to do that, and I'm hoping many people will be willing to do that too.
Courage is a necessity. It's a really, really important book. Thank you so much for your time, Professor.
Yeah, this was great, man. Thanks again. I'm glad we got it all together, and this was really a great conversation.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much for doing this.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the lie.